We are about to head into one of our perennial favorites, a keynote that we host every year with the, well, you know who he is, the amazing Peter Coffey. We're so grateful to have him. He is virtual again this year, and we're hoping one day to bring him out to Denver. But until then, he doesn't need an introduction because we've all heard him speak, we all love it, and we all look forward to it every year. So without anything else, Peter Coffey.
Good afternoon. They call me the unavoidable. So I can actually see the room. Quick show of hands. How many people remember what this event was called before it was called Mile High Dreaming? Just a show of hands. How many people were at the first Daydreaming at 5280 in 2016? Not a lot. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people have come into the Salesforce community since then. Is one that I could not have given 2 years ago for reasons which will become apparent. And if I had tried to do it a year ago, it would not have had the substance it's going to have because, you know, a few things have been going on. And because this is a Salesforce community event, as opposed to just kind of a general interest industry event kind of thing, I'm going to be sharing kind of an inside perspective that you know, might not be appropriate for a group that isn't invested in us either literally or professionally the way you all are. And I'm fine with this being quoted outside this room, but this is really aimed at a group that has your particular characteristics of knowledge of and professional commitment to and investment in Salesforce. I don't know if any of you can remember the mood in February of 2023. It was a very exciting time. The activist investors were swimming around us like sharks. I think at one point, 5 activist investors were identified as being interested in us in ways, you know, like, we think we can make you guys worth more. We think we can get you to focus more, blah, 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 blah. There was a lot of refocusing. And there were some very energetic conversations. But the reason that I'm talking about it now is that the amount of bright light and scrutiny that was being placed on just getting out there and being the business we needed to be and not expecting people to figure it out for themselves resulted in my doing some things that I had not done before. There are things I started doing in February of 2023 I'm still doing. What they amount to is that I crafted a new dedicated Slack channel within the company that is specifically focused every week on tactics that our people can use to amplify advantages or to refute, to demolish inaccurate understandings, to bust myths, and to counter inaccurate criticisms of Salesforce. It was an internally focused tool specifically aimed at giving our account teams what they need in customer conversations. And of course, if you're a Salesforce partner, you know, this is also very relevant to you. But this is not to suggest that this was not about customer success. And I tried an experiment for purposes of this talk. I thought, if I'm telling people every Monday morning, and I don't even take the holidays off, every Monday morning, there's an internal discussion of, here's something that you can have in mind when you're talking with a customer, a prospect, a partner, about things you should understand that make us useful, or things you should understand are being asserted that aren't true about why you would not want to be working with Salesforce. And that's what I do every Monday. But today's Thursday. So I'm going to flip the script. I'm going to take these things that I wrote for an internal audience about how to get people more excited about using Salesforce and turn them inside out. Instead of a verb of competition, which is used in these things as part of the title, it's one of my little reality checks against myself. Did I title this post with a verb you can use to compete with the people who are out there claiming to do what we do? I took all of the 81 things, the 81, typically 800, sometimes more like 1,000 word pieces that I've been writing. They've been sharing research. They've been offering, viewpoints. They've been sharing customer stories, just fed the whole thing. It's at this point, maybe close to 70,000 words into a carefully privacy controlled LLM. And I gave it one very simple prompt. No elaborate prompt engineering was done here. I just said, how can an independent IT practitioner maximize success with Salesforce? Which I think is very much about why you guys have invested, these 2 days in this group to come together and ask yourselves, what am I doing to maximize my success, given that Salesforce is part of my toolkit? Nothing else was done. That is the only prompt I gave. And I'd like to share the results with you. You are not expected to read the slide I'm about to show you, but it is what an LLM, in effect, thinks I said. I said to an LLM, here's 70,000 words I've been writing. What do you think I said about how customers could get the maximum possible value out of what we do? And in a very odd way, it's a fireside chat with myself. I wrote 70,000 words about stuff, and now I'm asking it, what do you think this says? And I'm really very surprised by the results. I'm something of a generative AI skeptic, and this greatly exceeded my expectations. This is the output. You're not expected to read it. This is only here as a matter of record to say, yeah, no kidding, this really is what the LLM digested out of 81 weeks of internally oriented posts. But here's the human readable version, which is our agenda for today. 12 specific ideas that I'll be developing in brief, but a little bit more form than this. And this is not built from my saying, what should you know? This turns out to be what an LLM thinks I think you should know. And it's kind of like holding a mirror up to my brain to find out what in effect it's been saying. The first thing it led with is the listening. And this is something we talk about internally, that if you walk into the room knowing what you want to deliver, we use expressions in here sometimes like, well, what's the first call deck? Well, of course, there is no longer a first call. When we talk to a prospect or customer, if you're a partner, if you're an internal champion for the idea of adopting this technology, you're talking to people who do not start out with a blank slate. And deep listening is so much more than waiting for the other person to stop talking so you can go ahead with the next point you wanted to make. And I want to share one of my favorite stories. When I was in a building that is deliberately an unmarked building, people who drive by aren't supposed to know what it is. And I was in there talking with some people who have some assets in space. And we were talking about some things they needed for a new operator, control and usage system for these assets. And there was something they said they wanted. And I, could have just taken the note and said, okay, yeah, we can do that. But we'd been talking about the things they were doing when they were using the system. And it just occurred to me, say, okay, now, if you hit that button that you just said you want to be available on the screen, if it took 10 seconds to answer, would that actually be helpful? And they kind of looked at me in shock and said, well, no, I'd never use it if it took 10 seconds to give me the answer. And without getting into a lot of detail about latency and the speed of light and other factors, I said, okay, well, it's physically impossible for that to be done in less than 10 seconds. They said, oh, okay, well, forget it. I don't know how many engineering hours and how much money got saved. Because instead of just writing down, this is what they want, okay, well, we can do that. There had been more listening going on, and I was able to go to the next step and say, okay, well, would that actually be useful if? And there's so much to be learned from that idea that if you merely listen and write down everything they say, okay. If you're not really listening, you're just waiting for them to talk, that's much worse. But real listening is when you're thinking about the motivation for what they might have just said, what might they have not said because they think you already know that, and then probing for that, and that turns out to be incredibly valuable. Sometimes in terms of money saved, and maybe just in terms of persuading the other person that you're really there to solve their problem and not just to get the chance to do the work you want to do. It also helps when lots of different people are involved in these conversations. Alignment can be really important very early in a process. If you work with the people who will be using the tool and build them what they say they want, you might later discover that there are issues around that using organization that keep them from using what you built for them that they said they needed. And for example, early on, we were working with a system that was going to involve access to certain types of data. And the way the end users described it, they were going to have edit and delete access to that data. If we had proceeded with the system they said they wanted and needed, they would have had that access. Fortunately, early on, corporate counsel were involved in the conversation, and they reacted to the idea of ordinary users having edit and delete access to that data with horror, and said that could simply never be allowed. If we had found that out later in the process and had to go back in and re-envision an entire workflow so that it would no longer be necessary for users to have edit and delete access, it would have been expensive. And there's a curve that you may have seen in one form or another. This goes back to research done by Capers-Jones and Barry Boehm about the cost of changing something, whether it's fixing a bug or changing a requirement, as a function of what stage you are at in the project. And this is my favorite version of this curve. 85% of the problems get identified, get committed by actions at the very early stages, but most of them only get identified in the later stages when it has been estimated to cost 640 times as much to make the change because of all the other things that have been done or the testing that's now going to have to be discarded and repeated and so on. And so the value of having everyone who might be playing Dr. No, everyone who might be saying, wait a minute, it can't be allowed to work that way, those people need to be in the room almost as early as the people who are telling you what it should be able to do, should be the people who are able to say what it should not be able to do. This is something Bruce Schneier in the security side has said many times. IT people like to work on something until it does the things it's supposed to do. They're not as excited about making sure it doesn't do the things it should not do, because that's 10 times as much work. But if it can save a factor of 640 on what could otherwise be a ballooning cost and a slipping schedule, it's worth that upfront pain. This also has to do with the subject of making sure you're building the system for the users you have, not for the users you wish they would turn into being so that they can use your brilliant system better. Among my favorite examples of this is the shapes of the control knobs on aircraft control panels. The knob that lifts and lowers the landing gear is actually shaped like a little wheel. And the knob that, if you pull it at the wrong time, will shut your engine down, has little barbs on the back, so when you reach in and are touching the back of the knob as if you're going to pull it toward you, you can't help but feel those little barbs there, and they really warn you, wait a minute, are you sure you're doing this? If you go to raise the flaps after landing so the wind doesn't lift you back up off the ground, you will not accidentally raise your gear instead, raise your wheels instead, because the knobs just feel different. And this is by certified by Code of Federal Regulations. This is not just a good idea. This is the law. We have been moving, of course, in our cars from knobs whose shape and position you know from muscle memory to touch screens that require you to take your eyes off the screen. And I've been writing about this subject of airplane control knobs ever since we started moving to touch screens for everything. If you aren't anticipating the fact that people are not mainly focused on admiring your wonderful system and using all its great features, they're in the middle of some other task, and you have to maximize the ability of the system to become part of their task and not have the system become their task. And if we build these things in at the beginning, again, it's a lot cheaper than doing them after the fact. This brings us to the subject of platforms. And the word platform has been used for decades. Early on, it was a fancy name for a vendor's package of stuff they wanted to sell you. oh, this isn't just a computer, this is a platform. Because you had a server and you had an operating system and you had a database layer. And at this point, we're talking about an IBM mainframe, maybe running VMS, maybe with DB2 running on top of it. And then you get a middleware stack. And after you've poured a lot of money into that computer-shaped hole in the ground, maybe in a year or two, you'll start to get some return. And that's what the word platform was used to do, to get you to feel you are making an investment and not merely buying a thing. But platform has become a more and more abstract idea. If you think about it, what is Uber? Uber relies on the availability of streets, the availability of automobiles, gas stations, and garages, the availability of driver training. It treats all of that as platform on all of, and with all that, it can just add the value of ease of access. So platform becomes a much more abstract idea. And at any given time, the word platform now means the level above which I'm creating value and below which I'm just trying to minimize cost. I really don't get very excited anymore about whether it's an Intel chip or an AMD chip in a PC. That's just platform. The really interesting questions have to do with the quality of the operating system interface that I'm putting on. It's not even is it Linux? Is it GNOME or one of the other interfaces? Is it which distribution is it? Because that controls which updates I'm getting. Platform now is about the ability to add value, and it's a platform in many ways. If the way it's given to you, you can do something useful with it. I mean, we once had we've had many customers say, look, I want to buy a CRM. I just want to do what CRMs do. The CIO at Franklin Covey once said, people who buy something and their first question is, how do I customize this? In effect, they're saying, I know how to do this better than you do, even though you've been doing it for years and you've incorporated the feedback of thousands of customers. I still want it to work my way. The largest service cloud deployment ever done was done at IBM at one point. And Bob McDonald said he had Ginny Rometty's Thor-sized hammer in his hand when people would say, I want to be able to tailor this thing. And he would basically hammer them and say, no, you don't know more about how a great service process should work. We're going to have one service process for all of IBM. It's going to be the world's best process. And you are not going to immediately warp it into the form of the process you've been using all this time so we can have 30 different IBM service processes. That's not what we're up to here. So the form in which it's provided should be really good, but as soon as you want to change something, you shouldn't need to break it to change it. You shouldn't need to start from the beginning to change it. And that is why an API orientation, why a modular orientation is so important. And I don't mean the kind of modules that are the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. There are people say, oh yeah, we've got a great modular design. But if you look carefully, the modules only fit together in one way. All they did was take the thing they had and break it up into chunks and put set and get methods on it and call them objects. No, they didn't build repurposable stuff. They didn't build anything that could be reconfigured. And a Rubik's Cube, yes, it's a puzzle, but more interestingly, it's an object that can have a very straightforward and simple appearance, but is very easily turned into other things. And then you can build an entire ecosystem of these things. And that's why App Exchange is as remarkable a thing as it is that the ability to modularize, extend, and tailor is there all over the place. And something lets you build better silos is not helping you. You need something that helps you integrate and fuse and unify data, not just something that lets you manipulate one aspect of it better than you could before. Crucially today, that largely means low code and no code. Why? Because what that means is that the understanding of the solution you're building can be so much closer to the people who know the problem best. Instead of them having to take a description of their problem, throw it over to the wall to the people who write code and hope that what comes back resembles what they had in mind. No, you want to get low code, no code ideas out there. I started at Salesforce 1 week after Apex Code went into preview, with the expectation that it would be GA soon afterwards. And ever since then, was the millions or billions, depending on how you count them, lines of Apex Code that have been written. I have said that every line of Apex Code is a needle stuck in the Peter Coffey voodoo doll, saying, tell me again why I had to write code to do this. Shouldn't you have learned over time that this needs to be a pick list? This needs to be a menu option. This needs to be a parameter. I should not have to write code. It's necessary that we have the facility of Apex Code, but every opportunity to make it unnecessary is one that I joyfully embrace. Because if you have a platform, then people are capable of actual innovation. And innovation is a really funny, interesting word because it gets misused a lot, especially by people who think it's a behavior. Hey, we're gonna be innovative. I have compared the statement, let's be innovative, to the statements, let's lose weight and let's get rich. Both of those describe an end state. They don't describe a behavior that's going to get you there. I'm going to lose weight. That's nice. Something you have to tolerate becomes something you can change. And noticing those moments is really important. Sometimes what makes it possible to attack that incongruity is a piece of new knowledge, something you didn't know before, something you know now, and say, oh, okay, all of a sudden that turns this thing we thought we just had to put up with into something we can fix. But then you run into people who say, yeah, but I'm used to the old way. And so you have to either notice or engineer a change in perception. Is Salesforce an example? Yeah, it's the only reason I'm still here. Is that we continually notice incongruities. This is something that goes back to our very origin when Mark would ask questions like, how come people use Google and eBay without going to a training class? And when it makes an improvement, they don't complain. They as opposed to at work, you have to go take a 3-day training class whenever a field moves to a new screen. What the heck is all that about? And one of the founding principles of Salesforce is that we should figure out what makes things discoverable, adoptable, and helps people feel agile in using their evolving capability, and always be seeking to maximize that. Well, how are we able to do that when, generally speaking, CRM was a type of system that had very low adoption in the enterprise before we started doing this? Well, the problem was that when you roll out traditional software, you embed it in the infrastructure you've got and the skill sets you've got. What we were able to do is say, no, we're going to multi-tenancy at the data layer, so that if something's scalable, if something's fixed, it's fixed for everybody. And instead of people writing code that gets tangled up and impedes their upgrades, everything that the customer and prospect build is going to be represented as metadata, so it gets carried forward without disruption when we do an upgrade. These two ideas, we talked about it in 2007. Do we actually have to use the terms multi-tenancy and metadata when the customer is in the room, or are they too technical? And I think what we've agreed is that over the following years, it was impossible to explain to people why we could do 3 upgrades a year without breaking their stuff, why we could maintain the levels of security and knowledge of what's going on that we could without the multi-tenancy. They were necessary to explain. But then, having offered people that, we had to address the question of, well, this is this incredibly sensitive data and you're going to put it in a system you don't physically control. I spent my first 4 or 5 years at the company getting people comfortable with that idea. And that's not a finished job yet. Most people now use the cloud unself-consciously and without a lot of apprehension. But there are still people who feel like the really important stuff has to be on a system they physically control. And you constantly have to be, rotating the radar and demonstrate with examples that people who try to do it themselves are doing something they don't do full time, don't do as well as paid professionals would do it, can't do affordably at scale. But innovation has to be more than improvement, because if you take the rivals you've got, the problems the costs you have, the legacy skills, and try to just make incremental improvement on that and say, look how innovative we're being. You're really not. Innovation is not improving the status quo. It's saying the status quo doesn't need to exist anymore. Building a better apparatus for putting LP records on the shelf at Tower Records would not, as it turns out, have been a useful innovation. The entire assumption that physical vinyl records on shelves were the way people wanted to consume music, that was going to go away. That would not have been an innovation. It would have been an incremental improvement at best, a waste of money at worst. And being able to recognize the moment when someone is saying, I need this. I've heard the principle called the 5 whys. Why do you need that? Well, why do you need that? Well, why do you believe that? Well, why do you think you have to do that? By the time you've asked why 5 times, you've probably gotten back to something like a root cause and said, okay, you realize that the problem you're trying to solve no longer really has to exist. You don't have to build a solution to that problem. You can ignore that problem. One of my favorite examples is the enormous amount of work people used to do to allow for concurrent editing of a document when everybody had a word processor running on their desktop, and they would build these ziggurats of stuff to try to synchronize the changes from one to another. And people still do things like send around a .doc file with markups embedded in it for everyone to read, as opposed to saying, we don't have to do that anymore. We can have one instance of the document living in Quip or some of the other distributed document access tools, and you can see the changes that people have made. You can roll back to previous versions. That's all embedded at that level. You don't need to simulate concurrency when you can actually have concurrency. And that kind of let's not solve the wrong problem is really important. And making the product better is one of those seductive traps. We have something, let's make it better, but it's also often completely inadequate because people tend to like what they know. They like what they've got. Anything that makes them give up something from which they feel a sense of mastery, you can actually show people get a dopamine rush from doing something and saying, boy, I'm good at this. And telling that's no longer a thing that's useful to be good at doing can be a little bit challenging. And Gartner has found that if you just try to do something that makes people happier by giving them something, quote, better, unquote, it doesn't really work if there's even the slightest whiff of taking advantage of that improvement being giving up something they know. Business-to-business groups need to believe that they're not messing up. People use the expression FOMO, fear of missing out, but for at least 2 years, it's been observed people have a bigger drive called FOMO, fear of messing up. And the relentless attention to profitability and solvency during the pandemic, the degree to which making a mistake that you might have been able to tolerate pre-pandemic, but that during those months of maximum stress would put you out of business, it's put people in a mood where they really need to be confident that they're asking the right questions, thinking about the right considerations, not screwing up, and in particular, focusing on the degree to which a new solution is going to integrate well with the things that are already familiar. Take the existing systems of record, make their data more valuable. Take the existing procedural mechanisms, help them function with greater visibility and transparency. Integration support and concentration on saying, all the ways you're going to add value to the things that people already have that they want to keep triples their confidence in moving forward. They might not talk about their nervousness on that subject. You might bring them the new tool and they might say, ooh, oh, shiny. Oh, pretty puppy. Let me pick it up and hold it. But if they leave the room and the next thing that comes up in their minds is doubts about, yeah, but am I going to have to do am I going to be copy pasting? Am I going to have a new swivel chair behavior to take the data I use every day? What you wind up with in many failed CRM implementations is that at the beginning of the week, people do a copy paste into a spreadsheet, work in a spreadsheet all week where they know they can ask any question they want. And at the end of the week, do a copy paste back into the CRM as a system of record to record what they did that week. And many failed CRM implementations, people log in, seems to be working, yeah, but they're not getting any actual benefit out of the process. And this is some work that Harvard Business Review reported on. Failed CRMs happen when people don't have seamless access to the data they need and the procedures with which they're already familiar to get stuff done. And in fact, there's a name for this. It's called endowment effect. It's been shown that once you have something, you will demand more to give it up than you would have been willing to give to get it in the first place. Now, people are rational actors. The price I'm willing to pay to get something and the price I would be willing to be paid to give it back up again would be identical. But it's clear, and it's also been called status quo bias. It's also called loss aversion. People are far more averse to giving up what they have than they are excited by the idea to get what they don't have. And this is something that we have to struggle against ourselves, because every year we do 3 upgrades. We want to come to you and say, hey, look at this great new feature. Well, we better make sure we've alleviated any concerns about the impact that might have on what you're familiar to doing. And the other thing is that you have to be anticipating people's questions about, well, if we do adopt this and it goes to scale, what happens then? If this is just a prototype, it's being used at small scale in one business unit, that's one thing. Scalability and complexity need to be addressed up front. Build the system for the scale you hope it will have if it's a huge success, instead of planning to do that scale later on. Machine learning being a great example. AI prototypes and demos are very easy to do. Envisioning, anticipating, and building the architecture you'll need to maintain and curate the basis for your machine learning. This is something Mark Benioff talked about in our call yesterday. We have customers saying, oh, we're really excited about what we're doing with AI. We're using this great open source technology and building and training our own model. And he has to have a conversation with them about, have you really fully thought out the cost of not merely training, but retraining, maintaining the data? This has brought big companies to their knees, even when the technology was something much more deterministic, like expert systems. Expert systems rule bases grew to thousands of rules, half of which needed to be at least touched and often refreshed or rewritten every year. They demoed well, and then they grew. And the apparatus to maintain them turned out to be far more difficult. And so it's really important that people not get really excited by how easy it seems to be to do it at prototype scale if they need to be acquainted with, well, here's the commitment you're talking about making if you're going to let this become a production capability. This is very much the case with people who think, oh, well, AI is under control now. We've got this European Union AI Act that's going to make the rules. It really should not be called an act, because it's not a law. It's a regulation requiring the member states to actually write laws. And that means that the different countries in the EU will each be interpreting that supposed act in their own way. And the timetable for it to take effect is 2 to 3 years. And the economists, satirized this by saying, here's the cage we're building for the AI beast. Well, 3 years from now, the beast will be way bigger than the cage. And so it's really important that people think ahead. Imagine the conversation you'll be having with your future self 2 years from now about whether you anticipated and built in the mechanisms and the processes for keeping this thing viable as it grew. I mean, you want it to scale. You want it to be able to scale. So you need to be anticipating that up front. And what we're doing now is trying to avoid the need to cage the beast in the first place by removing its teeth and claws up front with the zero copy network. Instead of saying, well, what's the regulation going to be for maintaining control of all the copies of data floating around, we can say, hey, what about building architectures in which prolific copying of data just stops happening, which you can add the value to the data without retaining a copy. And the fact that we have Amazon and Microsoft and others joining this network is, I think, a measure of real leadership that Salesforce is taking in this area, not by building something bigger and faster, but by building something intrinsically safer that we can allow to grow without having after the fact to find some way to contain it and make it safe later. Now, we already talked about loss aversion, and the LLM gave me 2 more points for conversation that really are kind of in the same space. That if you want people to get genuinely excited by what you're offering them, first, you kind of have to rip off the scabs and get them to be unhappy with what they've got. And that's not a nice thing to have to do. But people get numb to their pain. and showing people, reminding people of what they're currently tolerating. Do you realize that you're having to work with data that's a week old because of the process you've got? Do you realize that you're having to deal with inconsistencies? I know someone the other day who got a piece of correspondence from a company addressed to a former address, even though they thought they had done their address corrections, even though they'd been getting all sorts of other correspondence at the new address. I think it's pretty clear that at the other end of the rope, that company's got more than one customer address database, and they don't have adequate mechanisms for making sure that a change to one is propagated through the others. That's the kind of pain point that can be expensive, can damage customer loyalty, can result in real costs. And pointing out that kind of thing and saying, why are you, you don't need to tolerate that anymore. You can have a single source of truth. That's an example of a pain point that needs to be highlighted. And some of those interesting opportunities I've had with customers were when they had made a decision to commit to Salesforce, and they asked me to come in and talk to the entire sales team at the annual kickoff meeting to get them really excited about the power this was going to give them, the professional success it was going to give them, to get them over the hump of, as they say at Toyota Financial Services, the CAT scan, where CAT stands for, oh crap, another tool. Because people are accustomed to the idea that, oh gosh, here's headquarters' latest idea. Well, this is going to be a nuisance. It's probably going to take too long to work. I'll just keep getting stuff done on the spreadsheet and minimally mimic acceptance and adoption of this new thing until they give up. And again, the certainty is people are twice as sensitive to and more likely to resent a gain as they are to be happy. A loss as they are to be happy with a gain. And so you just have to be anticipating that and make sure you're selling excitement and not just, offering an improvement that maybe they can get or maybe they cannot bother about. Of course, none of this matters if you do not establish trust. If trust is not established, no one wants to hear about your great new features, and no one really wants to talk to you about their pains. They don't know they can trust you. And this is not about necessarily data security, although it's often used that way. One of my favorite examples is a while ago when the so-called Log4j vulnerability, a piece of ordinary logging code that was used all over the place, turned out to have a vulnerability. And there were companies that needed weeks or months to go spelunking down through layers of code with dependencies on other code with dependencies on other code before they could really say, yeah, now we're confident we don't have this vulnerability logging anywhere in our systems. And our customers were able to get a dashboard within about a week. We said, yep, taking care of it, it's gone. And this was often led to mandatory XKCD cartoon references to the modern digital infrastructure, where the stuff is really impressive until you realize there's one thing down there at the bottom that's been maintained as a piece of open source code by one person in Nebraska. And the day that it goes away, a whole lot of stuff gets broken. We've built a real Rube Goldberg apparatus in a lot of ways. And trust is largely about confidence that you know how it's working when it's working, and not merely that you're going to prevent the breakage, but you actually have deep knowledge that you can give people strong statements of what they can expect it to keep doing for you. Because only then are people going to be interested in going to whole new territories. Omnichannel, Angela Ahrendts when she was still at Apple before she went to Burberry, she said, if it's not omnichannel, how can you even call it marketing? Email marketing isn't marketing. Email marketing is doing email. Activities are not outcomes. Marketing is a comprehensive process today when the customer experience needs to span many channels. I once had a piece of hardware on my Fitbit, a fitness band, break, and replaced it with something I made out of a piece of paper clip. I thought it was a kind of cool hack. And I just I shared a picture on a social media forum with some friends, and I actually got a proactive reply from Fitbit because I'd mentioned the name Fitbit in the post, and they'd been monitoring. I said, "Wow, That's great, but we're concerned about the reactions of paperclip material to your skin. It's not meant for skin contact. We'd like to send you a discount code for a replacement Fitbit device. They proactively reached out to me on a Sunday morning while I was sitting in a departure gate at LAX. They initiated an offer, and think about the outcome that had. Number one, hey, Fitbit's paying attention to me as a customer. Cool. Oh, okay. 10% discount. If I had gone down to the local sporting goods store, maybe I would have replaced my Fitbit with a Garmin. They would have lost me entirely. Or maybe I would have just gone ahead and bought a Fitbit device at the local sporting goods store. And what would Fitbit have gotten after markup? Maybe 60%, maybe 50% of the retail price. And instead they got 90% by getting me to just buy it directly off their website by giving me the 10% code and retain me as a customer as well. In fact, turned me into someone who tells stories like this. That's what omni-channel engagement really means. And if you want to see some great videos about what a world of omni-channel engagement would look like, Corning Glass made these videos called A Day Made of Glass, because they want to sell fancy glass that can be turned into an intelligent highway sign or a home mirror that doubles as a touchscreen. They want to sell this stuff, but they built these beautiful videos called A Day Made of Glass. Just Google it. And you can see these amazing visualizations about what comprehensive, immersive, multi-device experience really could feel like. And this is something that someone said, it is about a constant experience that preserves continuity. What's not continuity? Continuity is when you, as most retail transactions do today, begin your search on your mobile device and you find something, but you would like to see a bigger image of it, or you'd like to share it with another family member who's involved in the decision, whatever. We had data several years ago that showed people were taking a screenshot of their mobile phone and emailing it to themselves so that they could preserve continuity of the experience and move on to a PC or some other device. That is not engineering an experience. This is what we had, the conversations we had again with Angela Ahrens at Burberry, where she said, we've got a great app, we've got a great website, we've got a great physical store, and they are all three separate experiences. No matter how well we connect them, they're still separate experiences. You need to engineer the experience and then have pieces of that experience be manifested in a mobile app, or be manifested on an ordinary website, or maybe they show up in your car, depending on what business you're in. The idea that Dunkin' Donuts would be able to proactively reach out to a customer and say, hi, see you're on your regular commuting route this afternoon. Looks like the traffic really sucks, but there's an exit 100 yards from you where there's a Dunkin' at the bottom of the ramp that would love to give you 50% off on your coffee today to help you get through a lousy afternoon. That's the kind of experience engineering that we've been talking about with customers for years. Because if you're doing the same old things, well, what's the point? It's about behavior change. Peter Drucker has said that invention is not innovation. Innovation results when invention achieves adoption. And adoption is behavior change. This is version 11 of something that many people see every day. And if you had been in a coma for the past 43 years and woke up, you would be able to sit down and start using this thing immediately if you had seen Xerox's pioneering new window icon menu pointer interface in 1981. You would not need any new conceptual training. You'd be able to do this. Oh, okay, I make a document, I have an icon, I drag it around, I put it in a folder, I click on it to open it up. Okay, cool. It may have been innovative in 1981. Nothing that has been done with it in the last 15 years constitutes innovation, constitutes behavior change. What's a behavior change? Instead of the work product being the main thing you think about doing, what about the work process? What about the conversation you're having, the problem you're solving, and the work products support that process instead of the work product being that process? Well, yeah, we spent $28 billion after doing this with Chatter. Well, we're doing it better now with Slack. So the $28 billion is paying itself back. There's more automation capability, more integration capability, more opportunity for discovery and collaboration in Slack than there was in Chatter. We probably could have built it into Chatter, but we bought Slack instead. And what has happened by adding AI-based summarization and recap and other features that keep Slack from overloading people and actually make them look forward to sitting down after being out of the office for a week. Instead of dreading the backlog of Slack channels they're going to have to try to digest, we've really built power tools now so that they can treat this conversational medium as the preferred way of getting stuff done. And that's genuine innovation. And we're really excited about where that's going. And I hope you are too. Because as Stuart Butterfield said back when Slack was still called Tiny Speck, no small innovation causes a large shift in how people spend their time. No large innovation has ever failed to change the way people spend their time. If you walk around the office and people are just doing the same things they were doing 4 years ago, but now they're doing them with nicer cosmetics on the screen, or maybe now something is a single click instead of a double click, you can't possibly consider that to be useful innovation. What I want to emphasize is that there's a lot of conversation about AI now that talks about, who's the leader in AI. And what I want to point out here is that transformations have been happening in succession for our entire history, for the entire history of our community. Because when we started doing this, the word cloud wasn't even being used. That came along several years later, actually toward the end of my first year. This phrase, cloud computing, emerged. We called it success on demand. IBM called it utility computing. But crucially, many people thought it was mainly about cost reduction through centralization and scale. We had partners who were early on pointing out to people they were going to have greater ease of adoption, faster time to value, far greater process agility by moving to a cloud model based on multi-tenancy and metadata, not an ASP model based merely on centralization and scale. Once everyone had cloud, once you were using something like, a Quip or a Google Docs or whatever, well, now instead of working on something on your PC and having to email it to yourself to make some final edits on your mobile device, you can say, no, wait a minute. I'm just going to make the cloud resources where I'm going to be doing my work. And now mobile stops being a subset of functions that's a mere accessory to your real computer and starts to become the entry point to discovering brands, the mechanism of 24/7 engagement. And early on, we recognized that, we supported that, because once everyone has a mobile connection, something else happens. In the movie The Social Network, a young student says to one of the people involved in Facebook, oh, it's freakishly addictive. I'm on it 5 times a day. My reaction to that, anytime in the last several years, have been 5 times a day. I'm interacting with something online 5 times an hour, maybe 5 times every quarter hour, 5 times a minute. When am I ever not online? Offline is the exception status when I go to the trouble of clicking do not disturb or hit the silent button to do something like this. And once you have multilateral social communities actively networking with each other, old models, broadcast models of advertising, here's my ad, I define my own message. No, not really. Now the networking community tells you what your brand means. This is what the folks at Coca-Cola said about the new Coke experiment. The actual phrase they used in a video we did is, we discovered we were not the owners of the Coca-Cola brand, we were the stewards of that brand. And the customers would tell us when we were falling short of their expectations of what that brand should mean. And that is what you want. You want to have a brand where your customers feel like you're the trusted steward of the brand. If you're a brand like a Patagonia, or a brand like a BMW, or a brand where people really identify with the brand. BMWs are not cars, they're ultimate driving machines. Whether you like that or don't, the fact is the brand has achieved that role. And when customers get mad at BMW, it's because they feel they're falling short of what the brand should represent. Same true for many sporting goods, same true for many other areas, not just in luxury markets. I mean, we're talking about things like Coca-Cola here. So the point I'm making in this slide is that this is not a succession of fads. It is not that we had this fad about mobile, this fad about social, this fad about AI. These are necessary extensions and enrichments. The transformations accumulate. Cloud made mobile different. Pervasive mobile made social emerge and grow, and the growth of social makes AI necessary for the proactive personalization at scale that people learned during the pandemic they could have, and they're not going to give it back. And there is value to doing this sooner rather than later. Companies that delayed cloud because they were they were skeptical, they took a long time to decide they were okay with it. Well, they were giving up significant revenue growth compared to firms that adopted cloud sooner. This is Sloan research, not Salesforce research, that moving to cloud sooner grew revenue for the companies that made that decision. That mobile, which we enabled for everything when it was only a quarter of internet traffic, well, it's now well over half of internet traffic, and considerably in the majority for the beginning of people's experiences with brands, for discovery and initial exploration, what a brand can do for them. And the fact that we've been able to say, hey, write it for the Salesforce platform, and it will run on iOS, it will run on Android. I think we may have been supporting Windows Phone longer than Microsoft supported Windows Phone. And we were supporting BlackBerry when people didn't even realize you could still buy BlackBerries anymore. And once people have those mobiles, they're out there, they become audiences. And ever since we bought Buddy Media for what was then the eye-watering number of 690 million, but even since we bought Buddy Media, we have been the audience identification tool for more than 10% of the advertising on Facebook alone. And if you're using social selling, if you're recognizing focused communities based on place, based on interest, based on behavior, you are simply doing more business than people with more conventional and outdated ideas about what an advertising demographic might be. So the final point, I'm not going to quote Peter Drucker. I'm going to quote someone who doesn't show up yet in the business school casebooks, Volodymyr Zelensky, the stand-up comic who became a pretty impressive leader for his people. Every day you get to decide, what are you going to bring forward as useful learning, and what are you going to leave behind as baggage? I use the expression the baggage game because there are people who would love to sell you a new handle for your suitcase. But sometimes you just don't bring that suitcase. And the decision about what the future of your company, your career, your partner, firm, and for that matter, society as a whole, the future isn't a place where we're going. People talk about the future like it's, like we're on the Small World ride at Disneyland and the water's just going to carry us there. It's the sum of the decisions that people like you in this room, I mean you guys, the decisions you make, the actions you take, the conversations you have, the baggage that you persuade organizations to leave behind instead of dragging it along on a better luggage cart, those decisions matter. They are the definition of the future. And it is always a compliment to be invited to share ideas like this with you at this amazing event, which has been going on now for so long. I really appreciate the chance to be with you because it forces me to ask myself, what do I actually think about that? And I usually find out things I didn't know. And in this case, I wound up asking an LLM what I appeared to think about this. This is what it said. So thank you very much. Great to be with you.